So I have my NFC North projections for the 2020 season. Basically, I'm going to walk you through my process of how I came up with those, and then we'll talk kind of position by position, things that really stand out to me as far as everything goes. All right, so I'll start. I did my win-loss totals. I talked about that in an earlier episode. The first thing I did after that was I went through and I statted out quarterbacks, because quarterback is a very kind of game script determined position. If you're down by a lot, you're probably going to be throwing a little bit more. If you're winning, you're probably going to be running a little bit more, and so your passing stats are going to be a little bit less. So what I did was I statted out each starting quarterback over the last 3 seasons, or as many seasons as they had. In this case, I think all 4 quarterbacks had 3 full seasons. And then on a couple teams, I even went through and looked at, like in the case of the Packers, the 2018 Titans, just because that's when their head coach would have been the OC there, and so his play calling might differ a little bit from what the Packers were doing at the time. So what I did was I went through, statted out everything, kind of wrote down all that data, and then came to some averages as far as winning by 1 possession, winning by more than a possession, losing by 1 possession, or losing by more than 1 possession. And that gave me some kind of solid numbers, some solid averages that I could use to come up with some projections based on what I think each team record was. So I had the Packers finishing 11-5. That means that most of their games they're probably going to be in control of. They're not going to have a ton of passing. I believe, stat Aaron Rodgers out for a couple more passes than what he did last season, simply because of the Jordan Love move. I think he's going to be a little bit more fired up at the quarterback position. So maybe a little bit more, even though it's not necessary. The Vikings I had going 8-8, so a little bit more as far as the passing goes from them, because they're going to be trailing more often. The Lions going 4-12, and this was different because obviously Stafford was injured for a good portion of last season. So what I did was I just took the attempts and didn't really look at the completions or the yards or the touchdowns or the interceptions, because Matthew Stafford's not going to have the same completion percentage or yards per attempt as like a David Blau. So obviously I then carried over that stat from previous years. And then the Bears were a little tricky. I actually statted out both Mitch Trubisky and Nick Foles for a 16-game season, and then kind of combined those into an 8-8 split. The thing that's really crazy, I'll show you here, is with Foles, he doesn't have a lot of data to go off of, and his data is actually like pretty impressive. His completion percentage is really high. His yard totals are actually pretty high, and then his touchdowns per attempt is actually kind of higher than what you would expect for a journeyman quarterback. So Nick Foles maybe throws off the averages for the Bears a little bit, but you'll see then I have just Bears QB because I did an 8-8 split, 8 games for Trubisky, 8 games for Foles. Then I went team by team. I took the passing totals for each quarterback, which you can see there on the video, and basically went through target shares and everything from this past season. And so, like, we're looking at somebody like Devontae Adams. We look at his target share within the offense. That gives us the targets. We look at his past kind of catch rate. That gives us what his receptions are probably going to be. And then it's kind of an estimate of yards per attempt and yards per catch. So then we just kind of come up with some totals based on that. And then the average touchdown per attempt or touchdown per reception total then gets us something that is a number that we can really work with. So I statted out each of those receivers, each of those pass catchers for the last season, did the same thing for the run game, and that gave me kind of the totals I got. All right, so let's get into things. With Aaron Rodgers, I have him going throwing 571 passes, completing 365 of those for over 4,000 yards, hitting 30 touchdowns, and hitting 32 total because he's going to have 2 rushing touchdowns. Basically, he ends up with 294.12 fantasy points. That would have put him at quarterback 8 in the 2019 season. So I think he's a kind of a low end quarterback one. Rodgers is one of the guys that I'm really thinking about going back and adjusting, just because I think I was pretty high on him. But we'll see as I do other conferences that might not really change. Kirk Cousins, 560 attempts, 372 completions, over 4,000 yards, 28 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, 258.52 fantasy points, which would put him at quarterback 15, which seems about right for Kirk Cousins. He's not like a top tier guy, but he's not somebody that you really want to just throw away. He's kind of a week-to-week streamer, so I'm pretty comfortable with that. Matthew Stafford, I had going 380 for 575, almost 4,500 yards, 4,469, 33 touchdowns. I did have him with 10 fumbles. Stafford seems to fumble quite a bit, and that's going to drop his fantasy points down to 290.76, which would put him at quarterback 9. I still like him to kind of finish above that. He was on pace last year to finish as a top 5 guy, so I feel low on that, but I think it could be easily adjusted with some rushing tweaks or fumble tweaks or something like that. And then the Bears quarterback position, I had finishing with 380 completions, 554 pass attempts, about 3,600 yards and 17 touchdowns. I have the Bears going 6-10. So because their record is indicative of a not great team, their quarterback play reflects that. 219 fantasy points, which puts the quarterback position for the Bears at about quarterback 25. And I don't necessarily, I'm a little higher on Foles. Honestly, I had to go back and adjust Foles' totals because when I had him statted out, his attempts, according to my math, was going to put him at like a near record pace of pass attempts in a single season. So I obviously had to go back and change that. All right, let's get into receivers. As far as Packers receivers go, I focused on 4 guys: Devontae Adams, Allen Lazard, Devin Funchess, and MVS. There's really only 2 that are going to be super fantasy relevant. If you want to see Funchess and Valdez-Scantling's numbers, you can go over to YouTube, check out the video. Adams, I have going, getting 138 targets, 94 receptions, missing 1,000 yards, going 995, but getting double-digit touchdowns with 10. That puts him at 249.5 fantasy points, which puts him at wide receiver 9. That does seem a little low for him. I really want him to I will probably end up making him a 1,000-yard receiver before the season starts. I just have to mess with Aaron Rodgers' past totals because, like I said, I feel like he's maybe a little too high and Adams is a little too low, so I need to split the difference there somehow. Lazard, I had getting 91 targets, 62 receptions, 819 yards, and 5 touchdowns. That would put him at wide receiver 35, so like a flex guy week to week. I don't think Lazard is going to be this great receiver, and I don't think Aaron Rodgers can really support 2 real top-tier receivers anymore. Adam Thielen, I had going 113 targets, 71 receptions, 984 yards, 7 touchdowns. That'd put him at wide receiver 25. According to what the 2019 totals were. And then Justin Jefferson, this one was kind of surprising for me. The way that I set him out, the target share I see him getting, I think he's going to take a lot of that Diggs work. 72 targets, 46 receptions, 704 yards, 5 touchdowns. That only puts him at 149.7 fantasy points. That's a wide receiver 46 finish. But for reference, Hollywood Brown was the wide receiver 46 this past season in PPR. So, I mean, he could be relevant some games. I also statted out Tajay Sharp and BC Johnson. I just don't think their numbers are super relevant. The most shocking guy was Kenny Galladay. I have him actually finishing as wide receiver 2 based on his numbers. In comparison to the 2019 season, 126 targets, 89 receptions, 1,386 yards and 9 touchdowns. I definitely think there's going to be some touchdown regression there, but playing a full season with Stafford, he was actually on pace to be the wide receiver too. So I think it's reasonable. Hopefully that little bit of breakout that we saw last year from him continues and he can actually fulfill that. Marvin Jones, I have getting 97 targets, 71 receptions, 887 yards, 7 touchdowns, 201.9 fantasy points. Just a really solid kind of flex guy on your team. I have him finishing as wide receiver 25 according to the 2019 totals. And then I also did Danny Amendola, Geronimo Allison for the Lions. I didn't do Quintez Cephas, who I think could be a surprise guy there. I just had no way of really knowing what to project him for. So he kind of ended up in my other category. But I wouldn't be shocked if end of season we're talking about him as well with the Lions. Allen Robinson, it's a guy who's been really popular, kind of rising up people's boards. 153 targets, 105 receptions, 1,132 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns. That puts him at wide receiver 11 with 246.2 fantasy points. Anthony Miller, I had finishing as wide receiver 36 based on these projections. 98 targets, 66 receptions, 907 yards, only 3 touchdowns. Miller came on at the end of last season. There's arguments there that it was mainly because there was no competition, but I don't really think the Bears brought anybody in. Ted Ginn is a little too old for me to really think that he's going to steal targets from Anthony Miller. I also did Patterson and Wims for the Bears. Riley Ridley wouldn't be a guy that shocked me if he came out of nowhere. I didn't really stat him out much because he had such a limited role last season. All right, let's move on to running backs. Aaron Jones is a guy who people really question whether or not he can repeat what he did last season. I have him as running back 7, getting 279 fantasy points. There is a bit of a touchdown regression. I have him scoring 9 rushing touchdowns, though, catching 4 touchdown passes. He actually didn't have that many receiving touchdowns last year. Over 1,000 yards, rushing, over 500 yards receiving. I think he's just a solid back. I think his role is pretty safe. Jamal Williams and A.J. Dillon, I have kind of finishing almost exactly in the same spot. Running back 54, 55, Williams with 85.7 points, and Dillon with 84.3. Dillon I have kind of filling a goal line back role and getting 6 rushing touchdowns, and Williams I have getting a lot more receiving work between the two. Dillon just wasn't a receiver in college, so I don't see the Packers using him that way. Looking at Dalvin Cook, this actually surprised me. He finished as running back 2 in my rankings. 317.6 fantasy points, 11 touchdowns rushing, 2 touchdowns receiving, 1,233 rushing yards, 613 receiving yards. If he can stay healthy, I think that's perfectly within the realm of possibility. The problem with Cook is he's probably not going to play all 16 games. He really hasn't been able to do that as a professional. So if he's able to do that, I think kind of the sky's the limit for him. Alexander Mattison, I had getting 102 fantasy points, finishing as running back 47. Not something that you're really jazzed about, but as a handcuff, he's definitely a high-end handcuff who's going to get some work anyway. The Detroit Lions split was a little interesting because obviously they have Kerryon Johnson, DeAndre Swift, and Bo Scarborough, I think is going to eat up some work. I actually projected Swift to finish with the most fantasy points, 149.6. That put him at running back 32. I don't think he's necessarily going to be the lead guy, but I think he's going to be used as a receiving back. He's going to probably lead in carries, but not so much that it's like a workhorse amount. Kerryon, I have getting 91 fantasy points, which puts him all the way down at running back 53. I think, unfortunately, Kerryon Johnson's goodwill with the Lions might be gone after all the time he missed last season. Let's move on to the Bears. David Montgomery, I have hitting 1,000 yards. scoring 5 touchdowns. Where he lacks is in the receiving game. I only have him catching 30 balls for 222 yards and 2 touchdowns, 195.4 fantasy points in PPR, which would put him at running back 21, which is okay. That's about where he's getting drafted, I feel like. But I don't know that you'd be super happy with it. Cohen I have going as running back 32, and that's mainly on the back of 66 receptions, 374 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. He's going to get a lot of receiving work for the Bears. He did last season, and I expect it to carry over. Let's move on to tight ends. Jay Sternberger was kind of a surprise for me. I have him projected as a tight end 12, 71 targets, 55 receptions, 611 yards, 4 touchdowns. Kyle Rudolph, I think he's going to kind of lose some work this season to Irv Smith. Rudolph getting 48 targets, Smith getting 70. Rudolph catching 4 touchdowns, Smith getting 5. I had Rudolph as a tight end 23, and Irv Smith finishing as tight end 13. Also getting enough points to finish at what would have been the tight end 13 in 2019 is TJ Hawkinson. I had him statted out with 125.2 fantasy points. I have him catching 6 touchdown passes, which might seem a little bit high, but the tight end landscape in Detroit is pretty barren. So I think he's the guy as far as that goes. And then the Bears tight ends, I only statted out Jimmy Graham and Cole Kmet. Neither one really is going to be relevant for fantasy. So I don't know what to do with that. 39 targets for Graham, 21 for Kmet, and 2 touchdowns for each. They're going to get some work because the Bears want to use the tight end, but I don't think either guy is in a position to really succeed. Graham because of his age, and Kmet because of his lack of experience and, frankly, his age. So that's what I have for the NFC North. Hopefully, if you have some issue with them, you're going to reach out and let me know where I went wrong. Thanks.